So, just like with the other cultures we've discussed, one of the most important things we need to know about is their mythology or their religious thinking. And here with the Greeks, we're still dealing with a polytheistic system or a multi godded system, but there are going to be some differences from the systems we've talked about previously. So, where do we start with their myth? We start with their first gods or the Titans. And we're not going to concentrate too much here. We're going to look more at the Olympian gods, but I wanted you to have a sense of this heritage and how it guides the thinking of the Greeks. So you'll notice that you start out with Gaia, right, Mother Earth in a sense, and Uranus, the father of the heavens. Now, note that unlike the Egyptians, now we've flip flopped the idea of earth and sky, and the earth becomes the more typical mother rendering that you see in most mythologies. Gaia and Uranus, right, had a similar incestuous relationship to what you see with the Egyptian gods, and have offspring, right, as well. One of the most important to the mythology is Kronos, or the god of time. Because what happened was, and you'll see this in a lot of the Greek myth, um, Kronos was feared by his father Uranus. This is something that seems to happen in the mythology: is fearing your children or fearing your siblings and wanting to control them. And it's a very interesting lesson on fate because if you look at how the Greeks believed, regarding fate, they basically said that fate was determined. You couldn't really do much to shake fate or change fate. They actually even imagined it like three goddesses weaving. Someone wove your fate, someone measured it, and then someone cut it. So, creation, measurement, the amount of time you get, and then finality or the end. Um, so they felt very strongly that your fate was determined and you could like dodge around certain things, but you couldn't put them off. They would eventually arrive. So when you see something like Uranus trying to control his children, you know it will end badly. So the myth is teaching you this in a sense. So what did Uranus do? He actually trapped his children inside of Mother Earth. So what Kronos did was, as you can see in the painting here, this is a much later painting by the artist Vasari, who is a Renaissance era artist, but I like what it visualizes for us here. Kronos made a weapon, a scythe, a cutting instrument, out of the iron that he found in Mother Earth and used it to cut himself out of his mother, in a sense, out of the earth to free himself and to castrate his father. Now, castration is often used as a taking away of agency or power move. Look at Osiris. The one thing that was missing when he was put back together was his penis. So the idea of the penis as the creator of life, you'll notice this keeps popping back up, right? And notice that these are very bloody stories. And you would think that Kronos would learn his lesson, but he actually also feared his children. Now, again, a much later painting from Goya, who was a romantic painter, so much later in the timeline of art history, but gives us a little bit of a creepy visual on the story. Kronos, basically swallowed his children or kept his children trapped in his belly, and finally had to be tricked by his wife to swallow a stone, so she could save that child, and that child will become Zeus. And we'll talk a little bit about the Olympian gods here in a second, but I wanted you to be thinking about how these gods were often very manipulative. There's a lot of bloodshed and gore in these stories, and that leads to what I think is the main thing you need to understand about these gods is that they were very much the gods of humanism. So if you think about what the Greeks were professing, that they were humanists, right, and they believed in humanistic principles, um, these gods actually act very humanistic in a lot of ways. For instance, the god Zeus, as I just mentioned, he was spirited away as a young child, was saved from his father's eating, I guess we'd say, swallowing, comes back later and overthrows his father and becomes the head of the gods, takes the gods to Mount Olympus, and hence we call them the Olympian gods. But Zeus had his problems. Zeus had his humanistic problems. Um, he was known for, getting around. His wife is Hera, the goddess of marriage, so you can laugh a little bit at this, right? But Zeus was known for loving all things beautiful. Boys, girls, didn't matter to him. And we'll talk about how the Greeks are very open about sexuality, and the idea of beauty and how that works. But so he was known for going off and having these little affairs. In the pottery image that you see here, This is the rape of Europa, as it's known. And rape, by the way, was used more as an abduction term here. So the usage of the word was a little different, right, than how we would use the word. And in that mythology, he turned himself into a white bull so he could basically seduce Europa, right? So notice that to me, this is a little bit like how people act, right? The soap opera characteristic. Who doesn't know that couple, right? Even if it's just on a TV show where, the guy gets around or the girl gets around and the other person in the couple is always fuming and upset and like feels betrayed, right? And they can't seem to live with each other and they can't seem to live without each other. It's drama, right? To me, the Olympian gods start to act like we do. They have a human streak to them. You can see this in someone like Aphrodite, who does not want to be with her husband Hephaestus, who wants to go hang out with Ares, the god of war. You can, think about this with the god Dionysus, who was the drinking and partying god, right? That these gods, in a sense, are about these human stories and these human weaknesses. As I mentioned, Aphrodite, she didn't really want to be with Hephaestus, who was known as being kind of ugly and lame. And when I say lame, I mean his leg didn't work quite so correctly. It was said he was thrown from Mount Olympus, right? But that she wanted to go hang out with sexy Ares, the god of war. And in this painting, which is a Renaissance era painting, but again gets to the point of the story here, Hephaestus actually made a golden net so he could capture his wife while she was doing, things with Ares and take her up to Mount Olympus and show her to the gods. And he expects that he'll be vindicated. But the gods kind of laugh and say, well, he's really hot. Ares is hot. What did you think was going to happen? And I would say it shows you a lot about human emotions. I think when we're wrong, we become very, vigilant that we will get justice. But often people who weren't wronged with us don't understand why they need to get in on that, right? Or again, people cheat on each other, and some people think it's funny, some people think it's abhorrent behavior, right? So again, I think that these gods, instead of being untouchable and removed in the sense of like the Egyptian gods, they're a god of the sun, right? Or they're the god of, this or that. Um, that they're not really on our level. These gods almost have that sense of being human. You can recognize things in them. These are some images related to Dionysus, who again I always say was the god of wine and partying. He's shown with his maenads, right, over on the left, and they would have these orgiastic festivals where everyone would get drunk in the forest, right, and run down animals and kill them with their bare hands. Notice they're wearing animal skins and holding up a rabbit, and they would drink their wine out of these wine craters that you see them holding, and just have fun, right? So again, I think it's important to think about how the realm of the gods has become more humanized, and I think more connected to humans. However, the worship of the gods was still, as I would say, a reverent remove as far as practice. These are religious systems where still you gave your offerings to a priest or a priestess, and they took it to the temple and did your offerings for you. So, very similar to the Mesopotamian system. They were, exclusive systems. You weren't supposed to go in the temple. You weren't supposed to do those things. But the temple is going to play a very important role, of course, in the religious system. And we'll look at the Parthenon to focus our attention on religious architecture. I often also bring up the Olympics because I wanted you to think about how the role of the Olympic Games relates to what I call the body beautiful culture or the sport culture of the Greeks. The Greeks were going to focus a lot on the body and especially the masculine body. Like you see here in these two athletic pieces, Myron's Discobolus and Lysippus's Scraper. And what I think is important to keep in mind is, this idea of fitness of body, fitness of purpose. And I would say to the Greeks, they didn't really have a separation between mind and body. They believed your body should be strong and your mind should be strong as well. So I would say fitness of mind, fitness of body is sort of their classic thinking on this matter. But again, the idea of sport and the body beautiful, I think it's important to look at that within their art. And finally, one of the last things I want to tell you about them is of course their gender orientation within their culture. They're a very male oriented culture. And if you just put these two art pieces side by side, it kind of tells the story for you. These are both archaic Greek statues. Notice the male is nude on display, perfect body, and then the woman is like a column you could put in a building, right? She's clothed in the peplos. There's no sense of sexiness. This is because in the earliest Greek days, really up through the classical period, men looked at men as equals. They didn't really look at women as equal to them, and this kind of related to all things in their culture, if you get my drift. Where they even looked at like their sexualized relationships as leaning more towards male sexualization in a lot of ways. Women were often viewed as procreation; that was their role. Later, of course, with the arrival of Alexander the Great, who was bisexual, very openly noted in the historical documents, we do see a shift at that time where the Greek sexuality seems to shift to a more middle ground, we'd say, rather than a male focused sort of ground. But again, I think if you're looking at their sculpture and looking at the way that men and women are represented, it's important to note this attitude. The final thing before we move on to start looking at the time periods of Greece is I wanted to mention that the Greeks were a very insular people. They're very xenophobic, which means that they were very much only interested in what they were producing and what they were doing. What was Greek was great. Why do you need to know this? Because I think if you get their attitude, you understand why they left themselves open to outsiders. They didn't think they needed to concern themselves with them. So, like when the Persians come and attack them, they're very surprised by it. They're like, "Well, hold up, we're the Greeks. You don't get to come in here and make a mess for us. Like, what are you doing?" So this attitude, it led to them creating a lot of fabulous art and culture, but I think also this attitude left them very vulnerable and left them not worldly enough, right, about certain things. Again, when Alexander the Great arrives, he's going to change their mindset. So we'll see that change at this time, but really during the Archaic and the Classical period, we have to think about them as a very insular, Greek is great culture.